The cathedral bells chimed midnight as Princess Elena walked down the marble aisle toward her arranged marriage. Golden candlelight flickered across stained glass windows, casting shadows that seemed to whisper of rebellion. At the altar stood Prince Aldrich, her betrothed, cold, calculating, and completely unaware that his most trusted guard harbored a deadly secret. Sir Marcus had spent 3 years protecting the royal family while hiding his true identity. Once the rightful heir to a fallen kingdom, he'd watched from the shadows as the woman he loved was promised to his enemy. His calloused hands, trained for battle, had never dared touch her skin. His heart, hardened by loss, had never spoken its truth, until tonight. As the priest asked for objections, Marcus stepped forward. "I haven't touched a woman in ages," he declared, his voice echoing through the stunned silence. Then he did the unthinkable. He kissed the bride, claimed her as his own, and shattered every rule of the kingdom in that single desperate moment. But what drove a loyal guard to commit such beautiful treason? And what price would they both pay for choosing love over duty? The kiss lasted an eternity and an instant. Marcus's lips, rough from years of silent suffering, found Elena's with desperate hunger. Her bouquet of white roses scattered across the marble floor as her hands instinctively rose to his chest, feeling the thunderous rhythm of his heart beneath the steel of his armor. For 3 heartbeats, the cathedral held its breath. Then chaos erupted. "Seize him!" Prince Aldrich's voice cracked like a whip through the sacred space. Steel sang as 20 swords cleared their scabbards, the Royal Guard's loyalty split between their captain and their prince. The wedding guests, nobility from across the realm, gasped and whispered, fans fluttering like frightened birds. But Elena didn't pull away. Her dark eyes, which had been dulled with resignation moments before, now blazed with something Marcus had never dared hope to see: recognition. Recognition of the boy who had once promised to show her the world beyond castle walls. Recognition of the young prince who had whispered dreams to her in secret gardens before his kingdom fell. "Marcus?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with wonder and disbelief. "But you're dead?" He smiled grimly, his thumb tracing her cheek as if memorizing the feel of her skin. "That was always the plan. Until I found I couldn't live without you." The approaching footsteps of the guards echoed like thunder. Marcus knew he had perhaps 10 seconds before they reached him. 10 seconds to explain 3 years of deception, a lifetime of love, and why he'd chosen this moment to destroy everything. "The night my castle burned," he murmured urgently against her ear, "I swore I'd let you be happy, even if it wasn't with me. I thought duty mattered more than desire. I thought protecting you meant staying away." His voice broke. "I was wrong." Elena's hands fisted in his cloak, pulling him closer even as armored men surrounded them. "You've been here all along," she breathed, watching over me. "That's why I always felt safe, even when your betrothed's cruelty showed its face." Marcus finished darkly. He'd witnessed Prince Aldrich's true nature in unguarded moments, the casual violence toward servants, the cold calculation behind every gesture of affection toward Elena. "I couldn't let you marry him, not when I know what he's capable of." Prince Aldrich's face had gone purple with rage. "You dare speak of cruelty, you treasonous dog? You, who have deceived us all with your false loyalty?" He gestured sharply to his men. "I said seize him!" But the guards hesitated. Marcus had trained half of them, bled beside the others in battle. He'd earned their respect through 3 years of unwavering service, even if that service had been built on lies. "Stand down," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a born leader. For a moment, old habits held sway. Then Prince Aldrich drew his own blade, pointing it at Elena's throat. "She comes with me," Aldrich snarled, "and you hang at dawn for treason." The temperature in the cathedral seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's hand moved to his sword hilt with fluid grace, and suddenly he was no longer the dutiful guard who had served in silence. The man who faced Prince Aldrich now carried himself with the lethal confidence of royalty, dangerous, desperate, and with nothing left to lose. "Touch her," Marcus said quietly, and discover why your father needed an entire army to bring down my kingdom. Elena stepped between them, her wedding gown rustling like armor. When she spoke, her voice carried the steel her future subjects would one day learn to respect. No, she looked at Aldrich, then at Marcus, and finally at the assembled crowd. I choose him. The cathedral erupted in shocked murmurs. Elena had just rejected a prince for a guard, or so they thought. Only 3 people in the room knew the truth. She had chosen a lost king over a cruel tyrant, and kingdoms had fallen for less. The cathedral bells had fallen silent, but their echo seemed to reverberate through Kyl's bones as he pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the abandoned bell tower. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a reminder of what he had just done, what he had thrown away, what he had gained. Princess Lyra sat on the dusty floor across from him, her wedding gown pooled around her like spilled moonlight. The delicate silver circlet that marked her as heir to the throne of Valdris lay between them, knocked askew during their frantic escape through the castle's forgotten passages. She hadn't spoken since he'd pulled her through the hidden door behind the altar, her hand surprisingly steady in his as guards shouted their names like curses. "They'll kill you for this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyl's laugh was bitter. "They'll try." He studied her face in the dim light filtering through the tower's narrow windows, even disheveled, even trembling with shock or fury, or something he couldn't name. She was devastating. "But you're wrong about one thing, Your Highness. They won't just kill me for kissing you." Her green eyes snapped to his. "Then what? For telling the truth." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "For revealing what your beloved Prince Aldrich really is." The color drained from Lyra's face. "What are you talking about?" Kyle had carried this secret for 3 months. Ever since that night he'd followed suspicious movements in the East Wing and discovered Prince Aldrich of Thorn in hushed conversation with men who bore the crimson crest of Valdris's sworn enemies. He'd watched from the shadows as gold changed hands, as maps of the castle's defenses were exchanged, as wedding plans became the framework for invasion. "Your prince isn't marrying you for love, princess. He's marrying you for conquest." "That's impossible." But her voice wavered. "Aldrich loves me. He's been feeding intelligence to the Mordain rebels for months." The words tumbled out now, urgent and sharp. "The wedding was never about uniting our kingdoms. It was about positioning himself inside our walls when they attack." Lyra shook her head, but something in her expression had shifted. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, or recognition. "You're lying. You're just—" She gestured helplessly at the space between them. "You're just trying to justify what you did down there. What I did down there was save your life." Kyle's voice was rougher than he intended, and probably doom my own in the process. Through the tower's ancient stones, they could hear the chaos below, shouting voices, running footsteps, the clatter of armor as the castle guard mobilized to find their missing princess and her traitorous protector. Captain Thorne's voice rose above the rest, bellowing orders with a fury that made Kyle's stomach clench. The man who had been like a father to him would be leading the hunt. Why? Lyra's question was so soft he almost missed it. Why risk everything? Your position, your life, everything you've worked for. Her eyes searched his face. Was it really just about some conspiracy you claimed to have uncovered? Kyle had dreaded this question almost as much as he'd longed for the chance to answer it. For 2 years, he had stood guard at her side, close enough to smell the lavender in her hair, but forever separated by the chasm of their births. He had watched her laugh with courtiers, dance with princes, and promised himself that serving her was enough, protecting her was enough. It had been a beautiful lie. "I love you." The admission hung between them like a blade. "I have loved you since the day I was assigned to your guard, and I have watched you smile at that man knowing he will be your ruin. I couldn't," his voice cracked, "I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy you." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting in the silk of her skirts. When she looked up, tears tracked silver lines down her cheeks. "You've ruined everything." The words hit him like a physical blow, but before he could respond, she continued. My wedding, my duty, my certainty about what my life was supposed to be, a laugh that might have been a sob escaped her. Do you have any idea what you've done? Started a war, probably. Definitely committed treason. He managed a weak smile. Kissed a princess. Changed everything, she whispered. Before he could process what that meant, footsteps thundered on the spiral stairs below. Their sanctuary had been discovered. Kyle was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his sword, but Lyra caught his wrist. There's another way out, she said, rising gracefully despite the yards of fabric hampering her movement. But first, tell me you can prove what you've said about Aldrich. I can. She nodded once, decisive. Then we run. The blade pressed against Kyle's throat, drew a thin line of crimson, but his eyes never left Lyra's face. In the chaos that had erupted after their kiss, she had been seized by her father's guards, her wedding dress torn and muddied, her crown askew but still catching the torchlight like captured stars. You dare defile my daughter before the entire court? King Aldrich's voice thundered through the great hall, though most of the wedding guests had already fled in terror. Before her intended husband, Prince Roderick stood frozen at the altar, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. I want him executed, now, before sunset. Wait. Lyra's voice cut through the tension like a bell. She struggled against the guards, holding her arms, her gaze locked on Kyle's. Father, please, let him speak. The king's laugh was bitter. Speak? He has already spoken volumes with his treasonous actions. But Kyle found his voice, rough with emotion, and the pressure of the blade. Your Majesty, I have served your house faithfully for 8 years. I have shed my blood for your kingdom, taken wounds meant for your family. If I am to die today, grant me the right to explain why I would throw it all away. There is nothing you could say. I carry the mark of the old kingdom, Kyle interrupted, his words falling like stones into still water. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the guard holding the sword seemed to hesitate. King Aldrich's face paled, and Prince Roderick stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Impossible, the king whispered. The bloodline was severed generations ago. Kyle slowly reached for the collar of his uniform, moving carefully under the watchful blade. He pulled the fabric aside to reveal a birthmark on his collarbone, not random flesh, but a perfect rendering of a silver tree with spreading branches, the same symbol that adorned the ancient coins sometimes found in archaeological digs. My grandmother was Elara Moonshadow, last daughter of the Silver Court, Kyle said quietly. She fled when your grandfather's armies burned the sacred grove. She lived as a peasant, married a blacksmith, but she passed down the old knowledge, the old magic. Lyra's breath caught. She had studied the histories, knew the legends. The Silver Court had ruled these lands for 1,000 years before the rebellion that brought her family to power. Their bloodline was said to carry actual magic, not just the ceremonial kind that modern royalty claimed. Even if this were true, King Aldrich said, though his voice shook, it changes nothing. You have committed treason. Have I? Kyle's eyes blazed. Or have I simply claimed what was mine by right? The old laws state that one of royal blood may challenge for the throne through trial of the heart. Those laws are ancient, meaningless. Are they? Prince Roderick's voice was sharp. Because if they're not, if there's even a chance they could be invoked, this changes everything. He turned to the king. Your rule, your legitimacy, even this marriage, all of it could be questioned. The political implications hung heavy in the air. Other kingdoms still recognized the old laws, still honored the ancient treaties, if word spread that a true heir of the Silver Court had emerged. The trial of the heart was never just about bloodline, Lyra said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. It required the willing consent of a princess of the current ruling house. The magic only worked if both hearts were true. All eyes turned to her. Kyle felt his breath stop. When he kissed me, she continued, her cheeks flushing but her voice steady, I felt it, the magic, like lightning in my veins, like coming home to a place I'd never been. She looked directly at her father. The old laws recognized what we have forbidden ourselves to acknowledge, that the heart chooses its own sovereign. Lyra, you don't know what you're saying, King Aldrich warned. I know exactly what I'm saying. She straightened, and despite her torn dress and disheveled appearance, she looked every inch a princess. I invoke the right of the trial of the heart. Let the gods and the old magic judge whether Kyle Moonshadow speaks truth. This is madness, Prince Roderick sputtered. You cannot seriously be considering— The law is clear, interrupted a new voice. Elder Mirren, the court's keeper of ancient knowledge, stepped forward from where she had been observing in the shadows. If a blood heir of the Silver Court makes a formal challenge, and if a princess of the current house consents to the trial, it must be honored. To refuse would invalidate every treaty we have with the old kingdoms. The king closed his eyes, decades of political maneuvering weighing on his shoulders. When he opened them again, his gaze was steel. Very well, but understand this. If the trial fails, if the magic does not recognize your claim, Kyle Moonshadow, you will die a traitor's death. And Lyra, his voice broke slightly, you will marry Prince Roderick as planned. And if it succeeds? Lyra asked, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Then, may the gods help us all. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering the only shelter for miles. Rain lashed against the narrow windows as Kyle pressed his back against the cold wall, his breathing still ragged from their desperate flight through the forest. Across the small chamber, Princess Lyrali sat on a moss-covered stone, her wedding gown torn and mud-stained, her dark hair hanging in wet tangles around her face. She hadn't spoken since they'd reached the tower, hadn't even looked at him. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the howling wind and the distant thunder of pursuing hoofbeats that had finally faded into nothing. Kyle's hand moved instinctively to the leather satchel at his side, feeling the hard edges of the sunfire crown through the worn fabric. The weight of what he'd done, what they'd done, settled on his shoulders like a lead cloak. He was no longer a royal guard. He was a traitor, a kidnapper, a thief who had stolen the kingdom's most precious artifact along with its princess. They'll kill you for this, Lyrali said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the storm. She still didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the rain streaming down the window. My father will hunt you to the ends of the earth. I know. The words came out rougher than he intended. Kyle pushed himself away from the wall, water dripping from his dark hair. I knew what I was choosing when I kissed you. Finally, she turned to face him, and he saw something flickering in her amber eyes, not gratitude, but a kind of desperate fury. You didn't choose for me. You didn't ask what I wanted. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. You were about to marry Aldrich. You were going to bind yourself to a man who— Who what? She stood abruptly, her ruined skirt swirling around her. Who treats his servants badly? Who drinks too much wine at dinner? These are your reasons for destroying everything? Kyle stared at her, seeing something in her expression that made his blood run cold. Lyrali, what aren't you telling me? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. What am I not telling you? Perhaps you should have asked that question before you decided to play the hero. She began pacing the small space, her movements sharp and agitated. Do you know why I agreed to marry Aldrich? Why I smiled and nodded when my father announced the engagement? Because you had no choice. Because royal marriages are political. Because Aldrich threatened to burn every village in his territory if I refused. The words came out in a rush, and she stopped pacing to face him fully. Because he has 3,000 soldiers at his command and a particular fondness for making examples of those who defy him. Because my wedding gift to him was supposed to include the location of every safe house where my people hide when his tax collectors come calling. Kyle felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Your people? Lyrali's hands moved to the sodden bodice of her gown, and with swift, practiced movements, she began unlacing the elaborate dress. Kyle started to turn away, but she spoke again, her voice steady now. Look at me, Cal. Really look. He turned back as the heavy wedding gown fell away, revealing the simple leather tunic and breeches beneath. But it wasn't her clothes that made him step backward in shock. It was the intricate tattoo that covered her left shoulder and arm, dark ink forming symbols he recognized but had never seen on royal skin. "The Thornwood Resistance," he breathed. "My grandmother was born in those woods, before my great-grandfather conquered them." She pulled her wet hair back, revealing more tattoos along her neck, markings that told stories of rebellion, of blood spilled for freedom. "Half the servants in the castle are my people, Kyle. Half the guards you've served beside for years have been feeding information to the resistance through me." The implications crashed over him in waves. "The crown, the real reason you were wearing it, was to steal it myself during the ceremony." She moved to the window, looking out at the storm. "Aldrich suspected something. The marriage would have gotten him close enough to root out every contact I had, every safe house, every escape route. And in exchange for my cooperation, he promised my father that he wouldn't slaughter the villages." Kyle sank down onto the stone where she had been sitting, the full magnitude of his mistake becoming clear. "I've ruined everything." "Not everything." She turned back to him, and for the first time since their escape, she almost smiled. "You've certainly complicated things, but you've also done something I couldn't do alone." "What's that?" "You've made it look like the crown was stolen by a lovesick guard rather than a carefully planned theft." She moved closer, her amber eyes serious. "The question now is whether you're willing to help me finish what we've started, or if you're going to keep trying to rescue someone who was never really captured." The hidden chamber beneath the cathedral had once served as a sanctuary for persecuted clergy, its stone walls bearing witness to centuries of whispered prayers and desperate pleas. Now it sheltered a different kind of desperation, as Lyra paced the narrow confines like a caged wolf, her wedding gown rustling against the ancient stonework. "You cannot simply keep me here," she said for the third time, though her voice lacked the conviction it had held an hour ago. The reality of what had transpired above was beginning to settle into her bones like winter frost. Kyle sat on a weathered wooden crate, methodically cleaning his sword, despite having sheathed it without bloodshed. The familiar ritual seemed to calm him, though his shoulders remained rigid with tension. "The palace guards will search every inch of the city. This is the only place they won't think to look. Because it's madness to hide beneath the very cathedral where you committed treason." Lyra stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. In the dim light of the single torch he'd managed to light, the harsh planes of his face seemed carved from shadow and flame. "They'll execute you for this. You know that, don't you?" His hands stilled on the blade. "I've known that since the moment I opened my mouth." The simple acceptance in his voice made something twist painfully in her chest. She had spent so many years watching him from the periphery of her vision, noting the way he stood straighter when she entered a room, the careful distance he maintained, the fleeting glances he thought she didn't notice. She had told herself it meant nothing, that a princess and a guard existed in different worlds despite sharing the same halls. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why throw your life away for something that can never be? Kyle looked up then, and the raw honesty in his dark eyes nearly staggered her. "Because watching you marry him would have killed me anyway. At least this way I could tell you the truth first." The torch flickered, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls carved with the faces of long-dead saints. Lyra found herself thinking of their expressions, serene in their martyrdom, peaceful in their sacrifice. She wondered if that was how Kyle saw himself now. "The truth," she repeated softly. "And what truth is that, exactly? That you've harbored some romantic fantasy about your princess? That you've confused duty with devotion?" Something dangerous flashed across his features. In one fluid movement, he was on his feet, the sword forgotten as he closed the distance between them. But he stopped, just short of touching her, his hands clenched at his sides, as if he were fighting every instinct he possessed. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't diminish this. Don't make it smaller than it is to make yourself feel better about what happened up there. What happened up there was treason. What happened up there destroyed any hope of the alliance my marriage would have secured. What happened up there may have doomed our kingdom to war. And what about what's happening down here? His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it might as well have been a shout in the intimate space. What about the way your breath caught when I kissed you? What about the fact that you haven't demanded I take you back to the cathedral? Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been carefully avoiding thinking about the kiss, about the way her body had responded before her mind could catch up, about the traitorous moment when she had leaned into him instead of pulling away. That was shock. Nothing more. Was it? He took another step closer, and this time she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Because I've been watching you for 3 years, Lyra. I know the difference between your polite smiles and your real ones. I know how your eyes darken when you're angry and how your voice changes when you're lying. And right now, you're lying. Her heart hammered against her ribs. You forget yourself. No, he said, reaching up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. I'm remembering myself for the first time in years. I'm remembering who I am when I'm not pretending to be nothing more than your shadow. The torch guttered, plunging them into near darkness. In the sudden intimacy of the shadows, Lyra could no longer hide from the truth that had been growing inside her chest like a thorned rose. She had noticed him too, had found excuses to walk through the training yards when she knew he would be there, had felt a hollow ache in her stomach every time they discussed her betrothal. This is impossible, she whispered. I know. His thumb traced across her cheekbone. But impossible things have a way of happening anyway. Above them she could hear the distant sound of boots on stone, voices calling out commands. The search had begun in earnest. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones slick with rain. Kyle guided his horse through the narrow mountain pass, every muscle in his body screaming from their desperate flight. Behind him, Lyra swayed in the saddle, her wedding dress now a sodden ruin of silk and mud, the crown still clutched against her chest like a talisman. They had ridden hard for 3 days, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The king's men would be closing in. Kyle could feel their pursuit like a cold blade between his shoulder blades. Every hoofbeat on stone, every cry of a distant bird made him reach instinctively for his sword. There, he said, pointing to the tower's shadowed entrance. We can rest here tonight. Lyra said nothing. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since they'd fled the cathedral, and each one had been sharp as winter frost. He helped her dismount, his hands careful not to linger on her waist, despite the way his heart hammered when she looked at him with those storm-grey eyes. Inside, the tower was damp and cold, but it was shelter. Kyle quickly gathered what dry wood he could find and coaxed a small fire to life. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in their light he finally got a good look at what his desperate act had cost them both. Lyra sat against the far wall, the crown resting beside her like an accusation. Her dark hair had come loose from its elaborate wedding style, hanging in tangled waves around her face. The delicate makeup that had made her look like a porcelain doll was long gone, revealing the woman beneath, fierce, beautiful, and absolutely furious. You've destroyed everything, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the crackle of flames. Kyle fed another stick to the fire, not trusting himself to meet her eyes. I know. My kingdom needed this alliance. My people were counting on me to secure their future, and you— Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands to her face. What have you done, Kyle? The way she said his name, like a prayer and a curse combined, nearly shattered his resolve. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during their ride, had rehearsed explanations and justifications, but now they all seemed hollow. I couldn't watch you marry him, he said finally. Not when I know what Lord Aldrich really is. She looked up sharply. What do you mean? Kyle reached into his leather saddlebag and withdrew a rolled parchment, its edges worn from handling. He'd carried it for weeks, debating whether to act on its contents. Correspondence between Aldrich and the Shadowlands. He's been feeding them intelligence about your kingdom's defenses for months. The marriage wasn't meant to create an alliance. It was meant to deliver your crown directly into enemy hands. Lyra's face went pale as she unrolled the parchment and read. Her fingers trembled as she traced the familiar seal at the bottom. This is authentic. I've been investigating the raids on your border villages. The attacks were too coordinated, too precise. Someone with intimate knowledge of your guard rotations and supply routes was helping them. Kyle's jaw tightened. When I discovered it was your intended husband, I couldn't. You could have told me, she interrupted, her voice sharp with pain. You could have brought this to my father, to the council. Instead, you chose to humiliate me in front of half the kingdom. Would they have believed a mere guard's word against a lord's? Would you have? He finally met her eyes, and the anguish there took her breath away. I know what I am, Lyra. I know the difference in our stations, but I also know that I would die before letting anyone harm you. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, and rain began to drum against the tower's broken roof. There were other ways, she whispered, but her anger was fading, replaced by something more dangerous, understanding. Perhaps, but none that would have stopped the ceremony in time. He leaned back against the stone wall, exhaustion finally showing in the lines of his face. I knew what it would cost. I knew I was signing my own death warrant. But some things are worth dying for. Lyra stared at the crown beside her, its jewels catching the firelight like captured stars. The weight of her birthright, her duty, her kingdom's needs, they all seemed impossibly heavy now. But so did the growing realization that the man across from her had thrown away everything for her sake. What happens now? She asked. We can't run forever. My father's men will find us, and when they do, I'll face whatever comes. Kyle's voice was steady, resigned. But you'll be safe. The truth about Aldrich will come to light, and your kingdom will be protected. And you. The question slipped out before she could stop it. His smile was sad and beautiful. I got to hold you once. For some men, that would be enough for a lifetime. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the dawn sky, its crumbling stones weathered by countless storms. Ilara pulled her stolen cloak tighter as they approached, her wedding dress now torn and muddied from their desperate flight through the forest. Every step away from the castle felt like another nail in the coffin of her old life. Kyle dismounted first, his movements careful as he scanned their surroundings. The silence between them had grown heavy during the ride, punctuated only by the thunder of hoofbeats and her occasional sharp intake of breath when branches caught at her gown. Now, in the pale morning light, the magnitude of what they'd done settled over them like a shroud. We can rest here, he said quietly, helping her down from the horse. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he pulled away, as if remembering the chasm that still lay between them, despite everything. The tower's interior was sparse but dry. Someone had used it as shelter before. There were old blankets in a corner and the remnants of a fire pit. Kyle moved efficiently, gathering kindling while Ilara stood frozen in the doorway, watching him work. This man who had thrown away everything for her was now reduced to scavenging in ruins. You're staring, he said without looking up, a ghost of his old smile playing at his lips. I'm trying to understand. She stepped inside, her voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday, you were father's most trusted guard. Today you're an outlaw because of me. The kindling crackled to life under his skilled hands. Orange light danced across his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched in every line. I was never truly your father's man, Ilara. Not in the ways that mattered. She sank onto one of the old blankets, the elaborate beading of her gown catching the firelight. The wedding dress felt like a costume now, a beautiful lie she could no longer wear. Then whose man are you? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Yours. I've been yours since the day you talked your way past 3 guards to bring soup to prisoners in the dungeon. You were 12 and fierce as a wildcat. demanding they be treated with dignity. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She remembered that day, how angry she'd been at the conditions, how she'd marched straight to her father afterward and refused to back down until changes were made. "You were there." New recruit on dungeon duty. His laugh was bitter. "I watched a child show more courage and compassion than I'd seen in grown men. You changed everything that day, and you didn't even know it." Tears burned behind her eyes. "Cale, there's more you need to know." He sat across from her, the fire between them like a barrier of light and heat. "About why I really couldn't let you marry Prince Edmund." Something in his tone made her stomach clench. "What do you mean?" He reached into his travel pack and pulled out a leather portfolio, its edges worn with age. "I've been investigating certain irregularities in the kingdom's correspondence. Letters that go missing, gold that disappears from tax collections, reports of bandits that don't quite add up. You think there's corruption in the court?" It wasn't entirely surprising. There always was, to some degree. "I think there's treason." The word fell between them like a stone into still water, "and I think Prince Edmund is part of it." Ilara's world tilted. "That's impossible. He's going to be king," which would make it very convenient for certain parties. Kyle opened the portfolio, revealing careful copies of letters and detailed notes in his precise handwriting. The attacks on northern supply routes, the mysterious deaths of tax collectors, the way information seems to flow to our enemies, it all points back to someone with access to the highest levels of government. She leaned forward, studying the documents. His evidence was meticulous, damning. "Father doesn't know. I was going to tell him after the wedding. I needed more proof. Something concrete that couldn't be dismissed." His jaw tightened. "But then I realized what I was really doing. I was going to let you marry a traitor to protect my investigation. I was going to sacrifice you for duty." The pieces began falling into place. His increased tension over the past weeks, the way he'd watched Prince Edmund with barely concealed suspicion, the desperation in his voice when he'd confessed his love. "So, you stopped the wedding. I couldn't let it happen, even if it meant destroying everything else." He looked at her across the flames, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Even if it meant you'd hate me for it." Ilara stared at him. This man who had given up honor, position and safety, not just for love, but to protect her from a fate worse than a loveless marriage. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the broken stones of their temporary sanctuary. "I could never hate you," she whispered, and meant it. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken finger against the dawn sky, its crumbling stones testament to wars long forgotten. Ilara pressed herself against the cold wall, watching Kai pace the narrow chamber with the restless energy of a caged wolf. 3 days had passed since their flight from the cathedral, 3 days of riding through hidden paths and sleeping in abandoned ruins, while the kingdom's fury followed like wildfire in their wake. "The northern border is only a day's ride," Kai said for the 3rd time that morning, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Once we cross into Valdris, King Aldrich's reach cannot follow." Ilara studied his profile in the pale morning light filtering through the tower's broken windows. The stubble shadowing his jaw and the dark circles beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, but it was the careful distance he maintained between them that made her chest ache. Since their escape, he had been unfailingly protective, yet maddeningly proper, as if that searing kiss in the cathedral had never happened at all. "And then what?" she asked quietly. "We live as exiles in a foreign land. You give up everything you've ever known for a woman you barely understand?" He stopped pacing, his shoulders rigid. "I understand enough." "Do you?" The words escaped before she could stop them, sharp with frustration. "Because I'm beginning to think you kissed me to save yourself as much as to save me." The accusation hung between them like a blade. When Kai finally turned, his grey eyes blazed with something dangerous. "You think I destroyed my honor, my oath, my entire life on a whim? I think you were looking for a reason to run." Alara rose from where she'd been sitting, her chin lifted in defiance despite the tremor in her voice. The perfect Royal Guard who never questioned orders, never stepped out of line. "Tell me, Kai, when was the last time you chose anything for yourself?" His jaw clenched. "You know nothing about my choices." "Then tell me." She stepped closer, ignoring how his breath caught. "Tell me why a man who served the crown faithfully for 10 years would throw it all away. Tell me why you kissed me like you were drowning and I was air itself." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Outside, a hawk cried in the distance, its call echoing off the ancient stones. When Kai spoke, his voice was rough as granite. "My father served King Aldric's father, died in his service when I was 12, his hands clenched at his sides. I swore the same oath, believing in honor and duty and the righteousness of kings. For 10 years I followed orders without question. I watched Aldric's cruelty grow, told myself it wasn't my place to judge. And then I stood in that cathedral and watched him claim you like a prize of war, and something in me broke." His eyes found hers, raw and unguarded. "You want to know why I kissed you? Because in that moment I realized I'd spent 10 years serving a monster, and I couldn't watch him destroy the one pure thing in that cursed castle." The confession hit her like a physical blow. "Pure? Kai, I'm not—" "You are." He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You think I don't see how you slip food to the servants' children, how you tend the kitchen maids when they're ill. You've lived in that viper's nest for months and somehow remained untouched by its poison." Ilara's throat tightened. "You don't know what I've done to survive. I know you never stopped fighting, even when everyone else bowed and scraped and let Aldric's darkness seep into their souls. You remained yourself." His hand rose as if to touch her face, then fell away. "You want to know when I last chose something for myself? Never. Not until I chose you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and peril. Alara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming relief of finally understanding. "And now? Do you regret it?" Something shifted in his expression, the careful guard he'd maintained finally cracking. "Every rational part of me says I should. We're fugitives now, hunted criminals with nowhere to run and no way back." He took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "But when I look at you, all I can think is that it was worth it. You were worth it." This time, when his hand rose, he didn't pull away. His fingers traced the line of her cheek with reverent gentleness, and Ilara felt her breath catch. The watchtower around them seemed to fade, leaving only this moment suspended in time. "So what do we choose now?" she whispered. Kai's thumb brushed across her lower lip, and his answer was barely audible. "Everything." When he kissed her this time, there was no desperation, no audience of scandalized nobles, just the two of them and a love that had already cost them everything, and somehow made them richer for the loss. The abandoned watchtower stood like a skeletal finger against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering little comfort but perfect concealment. Ilara pressed herself against the cold wall, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows above, while Kieran worked to start a fire in the corner they'd claimed as shelter. 3 days had passed since their escape from the cathedral, 3 days of riding hard through forests and sleeping in caves, always looking over their shoulders for the inevitable pursuit. Her wedding dress, once pristine silk and lace, now hung in tatters around her ankles, stained with mud and torn by thorns. She'd bound her hair back with strips torn from her veil, transforming from pampered princess to fugitive with each passing hour. "The fire's catching," Kieran said softly, coaxing the flames higher with careful breaths. Orange light danced across his face, highlighting the exhaustion that mirrored her own. "We should be safe here tonight. The storm will cover our tracks." Ilara nodded, settling beside him on the makeshift bed of their travel cloaks. The warmth felt like luxury after so many cold hours in the saddle. "How far to the border?" "Another 2 days, Perhaps 3 if the weather holds us back." He studied her face in the firelight. "Are you having second thoughts?" The question hung between them like a blade. Second thoughts about abandoning her kingdom, her duty, her entire life? Of course she was having them. But second thoughts about him, about the choice she'd made when his lips touched hers in that moment of desperate honesty? "Ask me something else," she said instead. A smile ghosted across his features. "What would you be doing right now if none of this had happened?" "Sitting in Duke Aldrich's castle, probably enduring another lecture about proper deportment for a duchess." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "Learning which fork to use for the 3rd course at state dinners, discussing which tapestries would be most suitable for the morning room. You never wanted that life." It wasn't a question, and she appreciated that he didn't pretend otherwise. "I wanted to matter, to do something meaningful with my position instead of being a decorative object passed between powerful men." She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "What about you? What did you want before you became my shadow?" Kieran was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the storm. "I wanted to be worthy of you." The admission hit her like a physical blow. "Kieran, I know how that sounds. The lovesick guard pining for his princess. But it was never about reaching above my station." He turned to face her fully. "It was about becoming someone who deserved to stand beside you as an equal, not kneel at your feet as a servant. You were always my equal. I just wasn't allowed to acknowledge it." "Weren't you?" The challenge in his voice was gentle but unmistakable. "How many conversations did we have about things that mattered? Real conversations, not just you giving orders and me saying, 'Yes, Your Highness.'" Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized he was right. For all her private rebellions against protocol, she'd still maintained the careful distance her position demanded. Even when she'd caught him reading her books, even when she'd noticed the intelligence in his dark eyes, she'd never stepped across that invisible line. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I let myself see you as anything other than my guard, I'd lose the one person in the palace who felt real. And now?" Now they were equals in exile, bound together by treason and an uncertain future. Now she could see him clearly for the first time, not the silent sentinel who'd shadowed her steps, but the man who'd read philosophy by candlelight and memorized her expressions and loved her with a patience that humbled her. "Now I'm terrified I've ruined both our lives for a fantasy." Kieran reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Tell me what frightens you most. That you'll realize I'm not worth what we've sacrificed. That I'm just a spoiled princess playing at adventure, and when the reality of this life sets in, you'll regret everything." The fire crackled between them, casting shifting shadows on the ancient stones. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills like the sound of pursuing armies. "Ilara," he lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I've watched you for 3 years. I've seen your kindness to servants others ignored, your fury at injustices you couldn't prevent, your strength in situations that would have broken lesser people. I know exactly who you are. Do you? You're the woman worth committing treason for." The words settled into her bones like warmth, chasing away the doubts that had plagued her since they'd fled. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges to test their resolve. But tonight, in this crumbling tower with storm winds singing around them, she finally understood what it meant to be seen. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering the only shelter for miles. Rain lashed through the gaps in the ancient walls as Kyle pressed his back against the cold stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The crown sat heavy in the leather satchel at his side, its weight a constant reminder of the magnitude of his crime. Across the small chamber, Lyanna hugged her knees to her chest, her wedding gown torn and muddied from their desperate flight through the forest. She hadn't spoken since they'd taken refuge here 3 hours ago, and the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Every time he looked at her, Guilt twisted in his chest like a blade. "You should have left me," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. Kael's head snapped up. "What?" At the river crossing, when the horses went lame, her dark eyes met his across the shadows. "You could have taken the crown and disappeared, started a new life somewhere far from here. Instead, you're trapped with me, and now we're both going to die for your moment of madness." He moved closer, close enough to see the tear tracks on her dirt-stained cheeks. It wasn't madness. Then what was it? The words erupted from her with surprising force. "What was that spectacle at the altar? What did you think would happen when you kissed me in front of the entire kingdom?" Kael reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. His hands trembled as he held it out to her. "Read this." Lyanna stared at the document as if it might burst into flames. "What is it?" "Your father's last letter. The real one." Her breath caught. "That's impossible. My father died when I was 7. He never what? Never tried to contact you? Never wondered what became of his daughter after Queen Morwen convinced everyone he was a traitor?" Kael's voice was gentle but insistent. "Read it, Lyanna." With shaking fingers she unfolded the parchment. As her eyes moved across the faded ink, her face went pale. This says..." She looked up at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "It says he was innocent, that he discovered something about the Queen, about the way my mother really died. Your mother didn't die in childbirth complications." Kael knelt beside her, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She was poisoned. And your father found proof." The parchment fluttered from Lyanna's nerveless fingers. "You're lying. This has to be some elaborate fabrication. Why would you?" "Because I've spent 10 years watching Queen Morwen destroy everything good in this kingdom." His words came faster now, a dam bursting after years of careful restraint. "Because I've seen what she does to anyone who threatens her power. Because your marriage to Prince Aldrich wasn't about alliance. It was about making sure you could never claim what's rightfully yours." Lyanna's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Kael pulled another document from his shirt, this one sealed with red wax. "Your birth certificate. The original one, not the altered copy in the royal archives." He broke the seal with careful reverence. "Your mother wasn't a minor noble, Lyanna. She was Princess Elena of Valethorn, first in line to the throne before she fell in love with your father." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Lyanna stared at the document, then at Kael, then back at the parchment. "You're saying I'm the rightful heir to the throne of Valethorn. Queen Morwen is your aunt, and she spent the last 20 years making sure no one remembered that her sister ever existed." Thunder crashed overhead, and in the brief illumination of lightning, Kael saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in Lyanna's eyes. The shock, the disbelief, and then something harder. Something that looked remarkably like fury. "She killed them," Lyanna whispered. "She killed my parents and stole their throne." "Yes. And you've known this the entire time?" Kael nodded, not trusting his voice. Lyanna was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what she'd learned. When she finally looked at him again, her expression had transformed completely. The helpless bride was gone, replaced by someone who looked every inch a queen. "The crown you stole," she said slowly. "It belonged to my mother. It belongs to you." She reached for the leather satchel with steady hands, drawing out the circlet of gold and sapphires that had seemed so alien on Queen Morwen's head. In Lyanna's hands, it looked like it had come home. "What happens now?" she asked, turning the crown over in her palms. Kael met her gaze steadily. "Now we decide whether you want to take back what's yours." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the crumbling tower, something far more dangerous than wind and rain was taking shape. Revolution had many faces, but it rarely looked like a muddy bride holding her birthright in her bloodied hands. The underground chamber felt smaller with Kael pacing its length like a caged wolf. 3 days had passed since their arrival at the sanctuary, and the weight of their circumstances pressed down on them like the stone ceiling above. Lyra watched him from her position near the flickering oil lamp, noting how his jaw tightened each time he turned at the chamber's far wall. "The longer we stay hidden, the stronger Aldrich's grip on the throne becomes," he muttered, running his hands through his dark hair. "Every moment we waste here, he consolidates power. And every moment we rush toward certain death accomplishes what exactly?" Lyra's voice carried an edge she hadn't intended. The confined space was affecting them both, but differently. Where Kyle grew restless, she found herself retreating inward, questioning everything that had led them to this underground tomb. Brother Marcus had left them alone after the morning meal, sensing the tension that crackled between them like lightning before a storm. The old monk's knowing looks hadn't helped matters, as if he could read the doubts written across their faces. Kyle stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You think I'm being reckless. I think you're being desperate. There's a difference." She stood, smoothing the rough fabric of the novice robes Marcus had provided. The simple brown cloth was a far cry from the silk wedding gown she'd never gotten to wear properly. "We need allies before we can even consider revealing ourselves. The people are our allies. They remember my father." "Your father is dead, Kale." The words came out harsher than she'd meant, but she didn't soften them. "And the people who loved him have spent 15 years learning to fear Aldrich's rule. Love and loyalty aren't enough to overcome that kind of terror." His grey eyes flashed, and for a moment she saw the boy he must have been, quick to anger, slow to accept hard truths. "So what would you have me do? Hide forever? Let him destroy everything my family built?" "I would have you think." She moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion he tried to hide behind his determination. "We have one chance at this, Kyle. One. If we fail, we die. I know the stakes." "Do you? Because it's not just our lives anymore." Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a gesture she caught herself making more frequently. The possibility she hadn't dared voice aloud, not even to herself. Not yet. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. When Kyle spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Sometimes I wonder if you regret it. Coming with me." The question hit her like a physical blow. She searched his face, seeing vulnerability beneath the warrior's mask he wore so carefully. "How can you ask me that?" "Because you had a choice that day. You could have stayed, could have found a way to make peace with Aldrich's rule. Instead, you bound yourself to a lost cause and a man with no throne to offer." Lyra felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking but opening, like dawn breaking over mountains. "You think that's what I chose? A throne? A crown?" She reached for him then, her hands framing his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I chose you, Kyle Ravencrest. Not the prince, not the rightful heir, not the symbol of hope for a kingdom. You, the man who was willing to risk everything for what he believed in, even if it meant sacrificing himself." His hands covered hers, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. "Lyra, I chose the man who looked at me and saw more than a political alliance or a way to secure his bloodline. I chose love over duty, and I would choose it again every day until my last breath." The kiss that followed was different from their first, less desperate, more certain. It tasted of promises and possibility rather than stolen moments and forbidden dreams. When they finally pulled apart, something had shifted between them, settled into place like a key finding its lock. Together, she agreed, the word a vow between them. A soft knock at the chamber entrance broke the spell. Brother Marcus appeared, his weathered face grave. "Forgive the intrusion, but we have visitors. Lord Commander Thorne and a small company. They're asking questions about travelers seeking sanctuary." Kyle's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. "How long do we have?" "They're being entertained in the main hall, but not for long. There's a passage that leads to the old wine cellars. From there you can reach the forest road." Lyra felt the familiar flutter of panic, but underneath it ran something steadier now, resolve tempered by love rather than driven by desperation. "Thank you," she told the monk. "For everything." Marcus smiled sadly. "May the gods watch over you both. You'll have need of their protection in the days to come." The ancient stones beneath the castle seemed to pulse with an energy Lyra had never felt before. She pressed her palm against the cold wall of the hidden chamber, watching as ethereal light traced patterns along the carved symbols. The crown in her other hand grew warm, its gemstones responding to whatever magic lay dormant in these depths. "The bloodline runs deeper than any of us knew," Kyle whispered, his voice echoing in the narrow space. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath against her neck. Yet the distance between them felt vast after everything they'd discovered. 3 days had passed since they'd fled into these forgotten passages beneath Castle Aldermere. 3 days of surviving on stolen bread and murky water, of following cryptic maps drawn by hands long dead. But it was worth every moment of discomfort for what they'd found. Lyra traced the ancient script with her fingertip, the words glowing brighter at her touch. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old magic, before the kingdom forgot its true history. I thought they were just tales to help me sleep." "Your grandmother was Princess Ilara's closest friend," Kyle said, stepping closer to examine the wall. "She would have known the truth about your lineage, even if your parents chose to hide it." The revelation still felt impossible. Lyra, a merchant's daughter who had been promised to Prince Aldrich for political alliance, was actually descended from the kingdom's most powerful magical bloodline. The very bloodline that had been systematically erased from history by those who feared its power. "This changes everything," she breathed, watching as the crown's central stone pulsed with silver light. When she'd first touched it during their escape, she'd assumed the strange sensations were merely her imagination running wild. Now she understood. The crown was responding to her magic, magic she'd never known she possessed. Footsteps echoed from the passage behind them, and they both tensed. But the familiar whistle that followed brought relief rather than fear. Marcus emerged from the shadows, his Royal Guard uniform replaced with common clothes and a dark cloak. "The search parties have moved to the eastern districts," he reported, though his eyes were fixed on the glowing symbols surrounding them. "What in the name of the old gods is this place?" "A sanctuary," Lyra said, finally turning away from the wall. "Built by my ancestors to protect the kingdom's magical heritage. According to these writings, there are others like me, descendants who carry the old blood scattered across the realm." Marcus shook his head in wonder. "Prince Aldrich's troops have been hunting you for theft and treason. They have no idea they're actually trying to capture the kingdom's rightful magical heir." Kyle's jaw tightened at the mention of the prince. "Aldrich knows more than he's letting on. This isn't about a stolen crown or a disrupted wedding. He's been systematically hunting down anyone with ties to the old bloodlines." "The marriage," Lyra said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. "It wasn't just political, was it? He needed to bind me to him before I discovered my heritage." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Lyra had been so focused on escaping an unwanted marriage that she'd never questioned why Prince Aldrich had been so insistent on claiming her specifically. There were other merchant families with more wealth, more political influence, but none with her bloodline. "We can't stay hidden forever," Marcus said, though his voice carried reluctance. "The kingdom needs to know the truth about their history, about what Prince Aldrich has been doing." Lyra looked down at the crown in her hands, its weight somehow both heavy and light at the same time. 3 days ago, it had been a symbol of everything she wanted to escape. Now it represented a responsibility she'd never imagined. "There's something else," she said quietly. "The magic isn't just awakening in me. I can feel others out there, like threads connecting across great distances. If I can learn to use this properly—" "You could find them," Kyle finished, understanding immediately. "Unite the bloodlines. Or get yourself killed trying," Marcus added grimly. "Prince Aldrich has spent years eliminating anyone who might threaten his rule. He won't hesitate to kill you, royal blood or not." Lyra moved to the center of the chamber, where a circular depression in the floor perfectly matched the crown's base. She'd been avoiding this moment, knowing instinctively that placing the crown there would change everything irrevocably. As she lowered the crown to its ancient resting place, the entire chamber erupted in light. Power surged through her veins like liquid starlight, and suddenly she could feel them. Dozens of magical signatures scattered across the kingdom, some weak and hidden, others burning bright with untapped potential. The revolution had begun, and she was no longer running from her destiny. She was embracing it. The ancient stones of the whispering caverns seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat as Lyra pressed her palm against the cold wall, feeling for the hidden mechanism her grandmother had described in hushed tones years ago. Behind her, Kyle stood watch at the narrow entrance, his sword drawn and eyes scanning the darkness beyond. "Are you certain this is the place?" His voice echoed softly in the cramped space, barely audible above the distant sound of rushing water. "My grandmother never lied to me," Lyra whispered back, her fingers finding the depression in the stone shaped like a crescent moon. "She said the crown of shadows was hidden where starlight never touches, where the old gods still hold dominion." The mechanism clicked, and a section of the wall groaned inward, revealing a passage that exhaled air thick with the scent of forgotten centuries. Lyra lifted their makeshift torch higher, its flickering light revealing symbols carved deep into the stone, ancient markings that predated the current kingdom by 1,000 years. They moved forward in silence, the weight of their stolen moments heavy between them. 3 days had passed since their escape from the capital, 3 days of running through forests and sleeping under stars, of stolen glances and careful distance. The kiss that had changed everything still burned between them, unspoken but ever present. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and Lyra's breath caught. The ceiling arched high above them, painted with constellations that seemed to move in the torchlight. At the center of the room stood a dais carved from black marble, and upon it, the crown of shadows. Kyle breathed. It was not what either had expected. Instead of gold and jewels, the crown appeared to be wrought from crystallized moonlight, its surface shifting between silver and deep blue like water under starlight. Ancient power radiated from it in waves that made the air itself feel alive. "My grandmother said it chooses its bearer," Lyra said, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming danger. "That it cannot be claimed, only earned. And what must one do to earn it?" Lyra's hand trembled as she reached toward the crown, stopping just short of touching it. "Face the truth of what you are, and accept the price of what you must become." The moment her fingers made contact with the crystal surface, the chamber erupted in light. Visions flooded her mind. Her grandmother as a young woman, wearing this very crown, armies of shadow-wreathed warriors following her into battle, a kingdom not of conquest but of protection, standing against creatures that emerged from the spaces between worlds. But with the visions came pain, searing through her like fire. She saw herself as she truly was, not just the unwanted daughter of a minor lord, but the last heir of an ancient bloodline. The blood of the Shadow Queens ran in her veins, and with it came responsibilities that would consume her entire life. Kyle's voice seemed to come from very far away. She felt his hands on her shoulders, anchoring her to the present as the visions threatened to sweep her away entirely. "I see them," she gasped. "The things that are coming, the darkness at the edges of the world." Tears streamed down her face as the crown's weight settled on her brow, heavier than any burden she had ever imagined. "Kyle, they're already here. In the capital, in the court. They've been waiting." He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes fierce with determination. "Then we stop them." "We?" She laughed brokenly. "You don't understand. This crown, it demands everything. Every choice I make from now on belongs to the kingdom's protection. There can be no personal desires, no love." His thumb traced the tear tracks on her cheek. "Tell me, Lyra. Tell me that what happened between us meant nothing." The words stuck in her throat. How could she explain that it meant everything, and that was precisely why it was impossible? The crown's power thrummed through her, showing her the threads of fate spreading out from this moment. Every path forward led to sacrifice. "The old stories speak of shadow queens who ruled alone," she said finally, "who gave up everything mortal to become guardians between worlds." "The old stories also speak of champions," Kyle replied, his hand moving to rest over his heart. "Warriors who stood beside them, who shared their burden." Before she could protest, he knelt before the dais, his sword laid across his palms in the ancient gesture of fealty. "I offer myself to your service, your majesty, not as a subject offers service to a ruler, but as a man offers his heart to the woman who holds it." The crown pulsed with sudden warmth, and Lyra felt its magic reach out to touch Kyle, testing him, weighing his resolve. What it found there made the crystal sing with a note of pure harmony. "Perhaps," the crown seemed to whisper, "some burdens were meant to be shared after all." The ancient oak's branches creaked overhead as Lyra traced the weathered bark with trembling fingers. 3 days had passed since they'd fled the capital, 3 days of hiding in forgotten forests and abandoned ruins, while the kingdom burned behind them. The smoke on the horizon had finally begun to clear, but the weight of what they'd done pressed heavier with each passing hour. "You should eat something." Kieran's voice came from behind her, soft but strained. She didn't turn around. The sound of his footsteps approached slowly, deliberately, as if he feared she might bolt like a startled deer. "I'm not hungry." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She hadn't eaten properly since the wedding, since everything had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Food seemed like such a trivial concern when entire lives had been upended by a single moment of desperate honesty. Kieran settled beside her against the tree trunk, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but far enough that they weren't touching. The careful distance felt like a chasm. Starving yourself won't undo what happened. Won't it? She finally looked at him, taking in the dark circles under his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. He looked as haunted as she felt. "Maybe if I just disappear entirely, everyone can pretend this was all some terrible dream." His hand moved toward hers, then stopped mid-reach. "Lyra, do you know what my father is telling people?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "That I was bewitched, that you used some dark magic to steal away my senses and make me abandon my duty." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. If only it were that simple. Kieran's face darkened. "Your father always did prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths." "And what is the truth, Kieran?" She turned to face him fully, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Because I've been trying to figure that out for 3 days, and I keep coming back to the same impossible conclusion." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The truth is that I've loved you since we were children playing in the castle gardens. The truth is that I've spent 7 years watching you be molded into someone else's perfect bride while I stood by and did nothing. The truth is that when I saw you walking down that aisle in that dress, looking like you were walking to your own execution, I couldn't," his voice cracked, "I couldn't let you sacrifice yourself for a political alliance that would have destroyed you." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Lyra felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the same wild rhythm it had beaten during their desperate flight from the cathedral. "And what about now?" she asked. "What happens when the search parties find us? When my father's guards drag us back to face judgment for treason and theft and—" "They won't." The certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "We're leaving Astoria tonight. Leaving." The word felt foreign on her tongue. "Kieran, this is our home, our kingdom. We can't just—" "Can't we?" He shifted closer, his blue eyes intense with sudden hope. "There are ships in Ravenport that sail for the Eastern Kingdoms. Places where Princess Lyra and the Royal Guard who stole her away would just be travelers, refugees maybe, people with new names and new lives." The possibility hit her like a physical blow. To leave everything behind, her title, her responsibilities, the weight of royal blood that had shaped every decision she'd ever made. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "You're asking me to give up everything," she whispered. "I'm asking you to choose." His hand finally found hers, fingers intertwining with a desperate gentleness. "Not as a princess bound by duty, not as a political pawn in your father's games, but as Lyra. Just Lyra. What do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. In the distance, she could hear the sound of hoofbeats, still far off but growing closer. The search parties were expanding their reach, tightening the net with each passing hour. She looked down at their joined hands, at the simple gold band that had been meant for Prince Edward's finger, but now rested on her thumb like a promise or a curse. 3 days ago, she had been prepared to sacrifice her happiness for the good of the kingdom. Now Kieran was asking her to choose a different kind of sacrifice. Not her happiness, but everything else she'd ever known. The hoofbeats grew louder, and time was running out. In a few minutes, they would need to move again, to run deeper into the wilderness or toward the uncertain promise of ships and foreign shores. She squeezed his hand tighter and made her choice. The ancient stones of the whispering caverns trembled as Ilara pressed her palms against the crystalline formation at its heart. Power coursed through her veins like liquid starlight, and she could feel the very foundations of the realm responding to her touch. The crown's magic had awakened something deep within her bloodline, something that had been sleeping for generations. "The binding is breaking," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the sacred space. Behind her, Kieran stood guard at the cavern's entrance, his sword drawn against the approaching sounds of pursuit. They had perhaps minutes before Prince Aldrich's forces discovered their location. "How long do you need?" Kieran called without turning, his eyes fixed on the narrow passage that led to their sanctuary. Ilara closed her eyes, feeling for the threads of magic that had once bound the kingdoms together in peace. Her grandmother's memories, unlocked by the crown's power, showed her the way, but the knowledge came with a terrible price. To restore the ancient protections, to heal the fractures that threatened to tear their world apart, she would have to sacrifice the very thing that had brought them to this moment. "Ilara!" The familiar voice made her blood run cold. Prince Aldrich emerged from the shadows of the passage, moving past Kieran as if the guard were merely an illusion. "Step away from the Heartstone." Kieran lunged forward, but his blade passed harmlessly through Aldrich's form. The prince smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth. "Did you truly think I was merely mortal, that my claim to power rested on birthright alone?" The truth hit Ilara like a physical blow. Aldrich's impossible knowledge, his ability to track them through the wilderness, the way shadows seemed to bend around him. He was bound to the very darkness that threatened their realm. "You made a pact," she breathed, understanding flooding through her, "with the Shadow Court." "The same court your precious bloodline has kept at bay for centuries," Aldrich confirmed, advancing slowly into the chamber. "But their patience grows thin, and the barriers weaken with each passing year. Soon they will break through entirely, unless someone with the true sight opens the way for them willingly." Kieran circled behind the prince, searching for some way to make his weapons effective against this supernatural threat. "You would doom the entire realm for power?" Aldrich laughed, the sound harsh against the crystalline walls. "I would save it from slow decay. The Shadow Court offers order, Kieran. An end to the petty conflicts between kingdoms, the endless cycle of war and want. Under their rule there would be peace." "The peace of the grave," Ilara said fiercely. She pressed deeper into her connection with the Heartstone, feeling the ancient magic respond to her call. Power built around her, making her hair whip in an ethereal wind. "I know what you truly serve, Aldrich. I can see it now. The hunger in the spaces between stars, the void that devours light itself." The prince's expression darkened. "Then you know resistance is futile. Join with me willingly, and I can ensure Kieran survives what's coming. Refuse and watch him die knowing you could have prevented it." Kieran met her eyes across the chamber, and in that moment Ilara saw everything she needed to know. Love, yes, but also understanding. Acceptance of whatever choice she needed to make. "There is another way," she said softly, her hands beginning to glow with silver light. "But it requires a different kind of sacrifice." The heartstone pulsed in response to her touch, and suddenly the chamber filled with the presence of those who had come before, ancient queens and kings who had guarded this secret through the ages. Their whispered voices spoke as one, revealing the final truth that had been hidden even from the royal bloodlines. The barriers between worlds weren't meant to be permanent. They were a temporary measure, a way to give the mortal realm time to grow strong enough to stand on its own. The Shadow Court's hunger could only be satisfied by submission or by something else entirely, transformation. Elara opened her eyes, and they blazed with newfound purpose. The shadows hunger because they've been severed from the light. But what if instead of keeping them out, we gave them reason to choose differently? Impossible, Aldrich snarled, but uncertainty flickered across his features. Is it? Elara smiled, and for the first time since their flight began, she felt truly free. Love changed me, Aldrich. It made me willing to commit treason, to risk everything for something greater than myself. If it can transform a royal guard and a reluctant bride, perhaps it can transform even shadows. She pressed both hands against the heartstone and opened her heart completely, not just to Kieran, though his love anchored her, but to everything. The fear and pain of her people, yes, but also their joy, their dreams, their fierce determination to protect what mattered most. The heartstone erupted in brilliant light, and magic flowed outward like a tide of liquid starfire. The ancient stone chamber beneath the castle felt like a tomb, its walls slick with centuries of moisture and secrets. Torchlight flickered against carved symbols that predated the kingdom itself, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper warnings. Kyle pressed his back against the cold stone, his breath coming in sharp bursts as footsteps echoed from the passage above. "They're getting closer," Lyra whispered, her wedding dress now torn and mud-stained from their desperate flight through forgotten tunnels. The crown jewels caught what little light filtered down, reminding them both of the magnitude of their crime. Kyle's fingers traced the hilt of his sword, muscle memory from years of loyal service, now turned to protect the very throne he'd sworn to defend. But from the wrong hands. The passage Garrett mentioned should be just ahead. It leads to the old mining tunnels beyond the city walls. And if he lied? Her voice carried no accusation, only weary acceptance of their impossible situation. "Then we die together." The words came easier than he'd expected. 3 days ago, death for treason would have been his greatest fear. Now losing her felt infinitely worse. A distant shout echoed through the tunnels, followed by the unmistakable sound of armor clanking against stone. The search party had found their trail. They pressed deeper into the labyrinth, following markings that Garrett had described. A fellow guard whose brother had died in these very mines, but not before mapping every secret route. Trust had become their most dangerous gamble, but it was the only currency they had left. The passage narrowed, forcing them to move single file. Lyra's breathing grew labored, and Kyle realized she'd been favoring her left side since their escape began. When he reached for her arm, his fingers came away wet with blood. "You're injured." It wasn't a question. "The window. When we climbed down." She tried to smile, but pain flickered across her features. "It's nothing compared to what they'll do if they catch us." He knew she was right. Treason carried only one sentence, and King Aldrich had never been known for mercy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd helped enforce that very justice for years, never questioning whether those he'd condemned might have had their own impossible choices to make. Here, Lyra stopped at what appeared to be a solid wall, running her hands across the ancient stones. Garrett said to look for the symbol of the crossed hammers. Kyle raised the torch higher, illuminating weathered carvings. There, 2 hammers crossed beneath a crown that looked nothing like the current royal insignia. When Lyra pressed against it, the stone shifted with a grinding sound that seemed to echo for eternity. The hidden door revealed another passage, this one showing signs of recent use. Footprints in the dust, torch brackets that weren't completely rusted. Someone else knew about this route. It could be a trap, Kyle murmured. But even as he spoke, they heard voices much closer than before. Choice had become a luxury they couldn't afford. They slipped through the opening just as torchlight began to flicker in the passage behind them. Kyle pulled the stone door shut, praying their pursuers would miss the hidden mechanism in their haste. This new tunnel sloped upward, and after what felt like hours of climbing, they glimpsed natural light ahead. The air grew fresher, carrying the scent of pine and earth instead of centuries of decay. They emerged behind a waterfall, the sound masking their gasps for breath. Beyond the cascade, the forest stretched toward distant mountains, territory that belonged to no kingdom, where they might disappear entirely. Look. Lyra pointed to fresh horse tracks in the mud near the water's edge. 2 horses by the depth of the prints, with supplies judging by the way they'd shifted weight while drinking. A figure stepped out from behind the trees, and Kyle's sword was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw it. But instead of royal colors, the man wore simple traveling clothes, and his face was familiar. Garrett. Relief flooded through Kyle's voice. I was beginning to think they'd caught you. The guard's expression was grim but determined. The horses are fed and ready. I've included maps of the northern passes. There are settlements beyond the Thornwood that don't ask questions about where people come from. Why? The question came from Lyra, and Kyle realized he'd been wondering the same thing. Why risk everything for us? Garrett's smile was sad but resolute. Because I've served in this guard for 15 years, and I've watched good men die for bad kings. Maybe it's time someone chose love over duty for once. He handed Kyle a leather pouch heavy with coins. There's enough there to start over if you're careful, but you need to leave now. They'll figure out the tunnel soon enough. As they mounted the waiting horses, Kyle felt the weight of his old life falling away like discarded armor. Behind them lay everything they'd known. Ahead waited only uncertainty. But when Lyra looked back at him, her eyes bright with possibility despite everything they'd lost, he knew they'd chosen correctly. The rebel camp buzzed with urgent energy as scouts returned with news that made Kira's blood run cold. King Aldric's forces had found them, 3 battalions moving through the southern pass, cutting off their primary escape route. She stood in the command tent, watching Garrett study the hastily drawn maps, his jaw tight with concentration. We can't outrun them, Marcus said, his scarred face grim in the lamplight. Not with the wounded and the supplies we're carrying. Then we don't run. Garrett's voice carried a finality that made everyone in the tent fall silent. We make our stand here. Kira felt her heart lurch. Garrett, there are barely 300 of us. The scouts counted nearly 1,000 soldiers. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that terrified her, not fear, but acceptance. Sometimes the only way forward is through. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Weapons were sharpened, defenses hastily constructed from fallen logs and rocky outcroppings. The rebels worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that dawn would likely bring their final battle. As the camp settled into an uneasy pre-battle quiet, Kira found Garrett standing at the edge of their position, staring out into the darkness where enemy campfires flickered like malevolent stars. You're planning something, she said, moving to stand beside him. Something you haven't told the others. He didn't deny it. There's a chance, a small one, that I can end this without a massacre. What kind of chance? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Aldric wants me dead, but he wants you back alive. If I were to surrender myself, challenge him to single combat for the crown. He paused. It's an old law, rarely invoked, but still binding. No. The word came out sharper than Kira intended. Absolutely not. You're not sacrificing yourself for what? For these people? For you? He turned to face her fully. Kira, I've made peace with the possibility that I might not survive this, but I can't make peace with watching you die, or seeing everyone who followed us cut down because of my choices. She grabbed his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers. Your choices? Garrett, I kissed you. I chose to leave with you. I chose to stand against Aldrich. Don't you dare take that away from me by pretending this is all your responsibility." Something shifted in his expression. "You don't understand. There's something I haven't told you, something about that night, about why I had to speak." Before she could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted from the center of camp. Shouts rang out, followed by the sound of steel being drawn. They ran toward the disturbance, finding a circle of rebels surrounding a lone figure. Prince Matthias stood in their midst, his hands raised peacefully, still wearing his wedding finery, though now stained with travel and dirt. "I come under a flag of truce," he called out when he saw Kira and Garrett approach. "I have a message from my father." "You have some nerve showing your face here," Marcus growled, his sword half drawn. "Let him speak," Garrett said quietly, though his own hand rested on his weapon's hilt. Matthias's eyes found Kira's. "Father offers terms. Return the crown, return the princess, and he'll grant pardons to the common soldiers who followed you. You and Garrett will face trial, but the others can go home." "And if we refuse?" Kira asked, though she already knew the answer. "No quarter given, no prisoners taken." Matthias's voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "Kira, please, end this madness. Come home." "Home?" She laughed bitterly. "To marry a man I don't love? To pretend that everything can go back to the way it was? You call that home? I call it living," Matthias snapped, his composure cracking. "Which is more than you'll be doing if you stay here." Garrett stepped forward. "Tell your father I accept his challenge. Single combat, as is my right as a knight of the realm. Winner takes the crown." "Garrett!" "No," Kira started, but Matthias was already shaking his head. "Father anticipated you'd try that. He's named a champion in his stead." Matthias looked genuinely sorry. "Sir Roderick has agreed to fight in the king's place." The name hit like a physical blow. Sir Roderick, the kingdom's most feared knight, undefeated in combat for over 15 years. Even Garrett's face paled slightly. "The combat will take place at dawn, on the field between our camps," Matthias continued. "Those are the terms." After he left, the camp fell into a heavy silence. Everyone knew what facing Roderick meant. It wasn't just a battle, it was an execution with extra steps. But as Kira looked around at the faces of the men and women who had followed them, she saw something that surprised her. Not despair, but determination. They had chosen this fight, chosen to stand against a king they saw as unjust. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or death. Tonight, they would face whatever came together. The dawn light filtered through the ancient stained glass windows of the cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor where Lyra and Kyle stood before the high priest. But this time, there were no unwilling participants, no political machinations disguised as holy matrimony. Only two hearts that had weathered a storm of betrayal, exile, and war to find their way back to each other. Lyra's dress was simple compared to the elaborate gown she'd worn months ago for her arranged marriage to Prince Aldrich. This one was made of cream-colored silk, embroidered with silver threads that caught the morning light like captured starlight. She had chosen it herself, just as she had chosen everything else about this moment. Kyle wore the deep blue uniform of the Royal Guard, though the insignia had been changed. Where once he bore the crest of a kingdom that had branded him traitor, now he wore the symbol of the new realm they had helped forge, a phoenix rising from flames, representing rebirth and hope. The cathedral was filled with faces that had become dear to them over the months of struggle. Marcus stood as Kyle's witness, his weathered face unusually soft with emotion. Beside him, Elena held baby Thomas, who had been born in the spring just after the liberation of the capital. The child gurgled happily, seemingly aware that this was a celebration. Lady Catherine sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had lost a son in Prince Aldrich, but gained something far more precious, a daughter who had chosen love over duty, courage over comfort. The former Queen Mother had surprised everyone by adapting to their new world with grace, finding purpose in helping establish schools for the children orphaned by the war. "The bonds we forged today," the High Priest intoned, his voice carrying throughout the cathedral, are not merely between two souls, but between all those who witness this union. For love, true love, strengthens not just the hearts that hold it, but the entire kingdom that shelters it. Lyra felt Kael's hand tremble slightly as he held hers. She squeezed gently, remembering another tremor she had felt in these hands, when he had reached for her in that dungeon cell, when he had pulled her from the burning palace, when he had held her as she wept for all they had lost in their fight for freedom. "Kael Thorn," the priest continued, "do you take this woman to be your wife, to stand beside her in times of peace and war, prosperity and hardship, to honor the love that has already proven itself stronger than fear?" "I do," Kael said, his voice steady now. "I have loved her since the moment I first saw her, and I will love her until my last breath and beyond." The priest turned to Lyra. "Princess Lyra?" "Just Lyra," she corrected softly, smiling. "I am no longer a princess. Today I am simply a woman marrying the man she loves." The priest smiled and began again. "Lyra, do you take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him through whatever trials may come, to build with him a love that serves not only your own hearts, but the greater good of all those whose lives you touch?" "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I choose him, as I have chosen him every day since he found the courage to speak the truth of his heart." As they exchanged rings, simple bands of silver inscribed with words in the old tongue, meaning courage and truth, Lyra thought of the journey that had brought them here. The interrupted wedding that had begun it all seemed like a lifetime ago. That frightened girl who had stood at this altar in a dress she hated, preparing to marry a man she barely knew, felt like someone from a story rather than her own past. The kingdom they had helped create was still young, still fragile. There would be challenges ahead, disputes to mediate, alliances to forge, and the constant work of building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But they would face it together. "By the power vested in me by the realm and by the grace of the divine," the priest announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Kael cupped Lyra's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "No more stolen kisses," he whispered. "No more secrets," she whispered back. When their lips met, the cathedral erupted in celebration, but for Lyra and Kael, the world had narrowed to just this moment, this kiss that was both an ending and a beginning. This time no one would separate them. This time love had won. The bells began to ring across the city, their joyous sound carrying the news to every corner of the realm. In the marketplace, in the fields, in the schools and workshops, people paused in their work to listen and smile. The Royal Guard and the princess had finally claimed their happy ending.